Hey, let's talk about spooky stuff. The macabre. Dictionary definition being disturbing or horrifying because of depictions of or involvement with death and injury. Okay, that sounds really fun. So what are some examples of the macabre? Besides, well, The macabre can be anything you set your mind to, though it is usually confined to trends that have emerged in various art mediums throughout history. It can be your favorite horror film, or your favorite horror game. It can be art that you like to oogle at. It can be a 3 a.m. night where you're laying drunk in bed pondering your inevitable demise at the hands of an uncaring and feckless universe with no integrity. But that's a bit too broad and boring for me. I wanted to start researching this topic,
aside from the fact that it was always a little bit interesting to me personally,
to get a better understanding of exactly what the macabre is and where it comes from. Why do people seem so obsessed with death and decay and all the other grossest, most unflattering truths of our existence? Why does the grotesque intrude our thoughts? More importantly, I had an inkling of an idea that the origins of the macabre could somehow be traced back as a reflection of modern culture and how the idea has evolved over time and more thoroughly integrated into our lives. So that's what I'll be presenting here today. Get ready to hop on the magic school bus, kids, because today we're going back to 15th century France. I want to paint a quick picture for you. You're French. Yeah, I know. Tragic. You're about 15 years old, you live in 1425, and your family is dirt poor. Poor as fuck. For the past several decades, France and England have been at war. All your extended family has now died of the bubonic plague, and you have to toil in the fields day in and day out to help your family pay back damages from the war, a burden that fell most heavily on French proletariat such as you and your family. Every weekend, a group of mercenaries come by and threaten your life if your parents don't let them raid your pantry. Before they leave, they beat the shit out of your dad just because they can. Famines are sweeping Europe, and the lack of nutrients has turned Papa into a pasty bean sprout of a beta bitch. He's 46, and one more crossbow whipping away from being sent to the Shadow Realm. So, all in all, life really sucked for 15th century French peasants. Endless war, economic collapse, sweeping famines, plagues, violent roaming mercenary groups make life treacherous at best, but there is something to look forward to. You love art, and you take any opportunity you can to visit the cities and see paintings and statues and listen to music played by live musicians. Recently, you've caught wind of a huge new mural being unveiled at Holy Innocents Cemetery in Paris. You've been eager and excited for months now, and you're finally going to be able to go and see it. You arrive at Holy Innocents on the big day. There is a huge tarp pinned up on the wall, and you're surrounded by art lovers from all over the country. There's rich and affluent people from Paris there. There's art connoisseurs and historians from far and wide. And there's even a handful of lowly peasants such as yourself there. The curtain drops and you're presented with... well, you don't really know what to make of it. It's a bunch of skeletons and corpses, dancing on top of graves. In the mural, there's skeletons in crowns, some in holy garbs, and some even in dirty potato sack overalls. You're a bit confused. It's just dead people at a cemetery? I don't know, that seems a little tasteless, weird, and a little uncomfortable. You expected a joyous piece of art, perhaps one celebrating devotion to God, or the beauty and perfection of the afterlife, not one that goes out of its way to remind people at a cemetery that they're going to die, and that dusty-ass skeletons are going to be hitting the woe on top of your grave. Your overall impression is one of disappointment. You head back home and continue your peasant life for a few more months. Then, later, unexpectedly, your father dies. You and your family's world is shattered and only infinitely more uncertain. The arrangements are made, and soon you will be delivering his body to the Holy Innocent Cemetery. After the funeral, you're preparing to unpause the world. Life must continue as it always had. Before you leave, you take one more look at the mural, and this time it resonates much more deeply with you. Your father was lying in the earth, not only amongst his fellow peasants, but also in the ranks of nobles and bishops and kings, together in death and dancing together despite their death. You just wish you could have seen your father dance. Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death, is an artistic trend stemming from 1400s France. It depicts death as the great equalizer or unifier, no matter one's wealth, stature, power, or influence. From the dust they came, and to the dust they will return, no matter from dearth or from abundance. The mural at the Holy Innocent Cemetery I mentioned in our cute little story was a real mural. However, it has since been lost to time, and to my knowledge, the earliest depiction that survived to the modern era was a piece by Michael Valgamut literally titled The Dance of Death. Like earlier depictions, this mural showed several different types and classes of people dancing on top of the grave of a newly deceased person, the typical hazing ritual for their ultra-elite frat party, the Deadass MFs. Population everyone who's ever lived. A fun tidbit about this art trend is that it may have been the genesis of wearing costumes for All-Hallowtide, the holy season falling between modern-day Halloween and Christmas. It's not super important to the point, at all, but I did think it was just a bit interesting. Examples of the Danse Macabre continued to spread throughout the 15th century, with depictions popping up in Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and Croatia all throughout the Middle Ages. The idea of death in art was popularized by the series of aforementioned tragedies, wars, famines, plagues, etc. The ever-looming threat of death caused people to feverishly seek relief and penance, a desire that manifested itself in one last gentle dance, an expression of worldly amusement and joy before succumbing to death's cold and inevitable grasp. It appears to almost be a satirical response. In a borderline comical manner, the ground opens up and ejects skeletons to get up and dance, and use joy to take the focus off the grief and loss that is most typically associated with death. And, of course, once any art trend hits the mainstream like that, the normies are going to start to water it down a little bit. This appears to be a somewhat revised and more joyful spin on the Danse Macabre's original intention of grimly reminding people that no matter what they do or who they are, they cannot escape death. This appears to be the first widespread instance of independent peoples using art to find solace either because of or in the face of their own mortality, particularly in a non-religious context, and even more particularly in such a macabre way. It's like, imagine your parent is on their deathbed, you're sobbing your eyes out, everything just sucks really bad right now. And just before the monitor flatlines, this asshole hops up and does the Charleston like Grandpa Joe before he just kills over. That's pretty fucked up if you ask me. Like, borderline traumatic. And do keep in mind that this was some hardcore shit for the 1400s. By the 17th century, the macabre began to spread through other facets of pop culture. In 1824, composer Franz Schubert, upon realizing he had fallen seriously ill and would soon be dying, wrote String Quartet No. 14, also known as Death and the Maiden. A quote from Franz, written in a letter to a friend of his during this time, reveals a little bit about his mental state. The letter reads, "Think of a man whose health can never be restored, and who from sheer despair makes matters worse instead of better. Think, I say, of a man whose brightest hopes have come to nothing, and to whom love and friendship are but torture. and whose enthusiasm for the beautiful is fast vanishing. And ask yourself if such a man is not truly unhappy. String Quartet number 14 itself is quite long, so I won't be going over the whole thing. Is fast-paced, suspenseful, and vicious, meant to represent the futility of fighting against death. The following movements of this song further elaborate on this symbolism until the fourth and final movement. The fourth movement is what's known as a tranatella, which, to my understanding, is upbeat folk music meant to ward off bad juju. I'll be the first to admit, I don't know shit about classical music, and so that's why this is such a shallow and boring analysis. I am more of a small brain rock and roll type of guy, so if you're a classical stan and you're gonna hate on me for this, you're a big nerd. Anyways, this final movement, one of feudal dance in the face of death, is about as danse sous les nez macabre as something could be. I don't know French. Death and the Maiden was inspired by an earlier piece Schubert had written in 1817 known as Der Tod und das Machten, with lyrics by German poet Matthias Claudius. This piece, a much simpler arrangement featuring only a pianist and vocalist, depicts a conversation between Death and the Maiden. The Maiden's verse reads, pass by, away, cruel death. I am still young. Leave me, dear one, and do not touch me. And Death's verse reads, give me your hand, you lovely and tender creature. I am your friend, and not come to chastise. Be of good faith, I am not cruel, and you shall sleep softly in my arms. Okay, so maybe that's a little bit more on the nose, but he didn't know he was dying at the time. So quartet number 14 really has that oomph factor of the composer's own mortality and their lived experience or whatever. The real pop culture explosion of the macabre, one that is still felt today, began with the 1874 piece by Camille Saint-Saëns, both inspired by and aptly named Danse Macabre, or The Dance of Death. Listening to this piece versus quartet number 14, I can definitely see why this one took off more. It's way more of a banger, and is way more digestible at only around 7 minutes long rather than over 30. This track is significantly more dynamic and paints a much more furious picture of dancing ecstatically in the face of and in defiance of death. It begins with a warning, fluttering sounds of romantic orchestral music before viciously smacking you again and again with heavy and abrupt waves of danger and imminence. What is unique about this track, as opposed to other earlier tracks such as Quartet number 14, is its long-standing ubiquity in pop culture, and how it's remained relevant in media even to this day, persisting throughout the 20th and 21st century and being featured in several pieces of media, including film and TV shows. A derivative of the original track, known as the Skeleton Dance, was the first song featured in Disney's Silly Symphony series in 1929. It depicted goofy, jolly skeletons getting their groove on right on your 8-inch black and white family telly. I would say that this is perhaps the first time that the macabre has been presented in such a way to blah 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 blah, but there's so much macabre media, particularly literature, that we haven't even began to touch on yet, including people like Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, and H.P. Lovecraft, and those are just some American ones off the top of my head. But I do hope you get what I'm trying to say here. This was the skeleton hand over the bowl of candy, the Grim Reaper animatronic that scares kiddies on Halloween. A further bastardized and sanitized version of death, this time aimed directly at the youth, those who usually have no real concrete understanding of their own mortality. Yet, I think you get the gist. So, what do we know so far? The macabre emerged in art and culture in the 15th century as a way to find relief in the face of death. It spread prominently through post-medieval orchestral music and eventually made its way into children's animated shorts on Disney. The macabre continued to spread through various blossoming forms of media such as film, with an example being the 1957 film The Seventh Seal, which depicted death as a moderately creepy guy in an all-black jumpsuit, and on TV, a trend that is still going today. However, this modern macabre trend did seemingly peak in the mid-2000s and early 2010s, with a huge slew of horror films such as The Ring, The Exorcism, The Grudge, Final Destination, and with TV shows like AMC's The Walking Dead, a show literally littered with death and decay and the dead rising from their graves. It does not get much more mainstream and normalized than AMC's The Walking Dead. And that leads us to the wonderful modern age of the internet, where the macabre is flourishing more than ever. Music, art, and digital media have become increasingly gruesome, grim, and disturbing. And seemingly, as its prominence in our culture grew, so did our desensitization to it. How many times have you played a video game and spent hours endlessly mowing down images of other people? How many times did you really feel the gravity of everyone on Earth being murdered in a Marvel movie? It seems people have become wholly comfortable with the idea of death, or at least depictions of it in our media. But why? Why does jiggy skeletons, death, decay, and the dead rising from their graves tickle our fancies so much that The Walking Dead was milked for 11 seasons over 11 years? This is where the anecdote starts. I recall some of my first fawnings over the macabre. Sometime in my early teens, I made an Instagram account, one dedicated to horror and disturbing, surreal art. It had all the run-of-the-mill edgy shit that horrorcore stans will plaster on the internet. A unicorn turned inside out. A group of miniature aliens crawling out of a bloated human corpse. A ragged king being pulled apart by masses of starving peasants. You know, the good stuff. Now, I'm not here to psychoanalyze billions of teenagers that have come and gone over the years, but it is awfully curious to me that teens, in all their naive and beautiful angst, love this edgy shit. My theory is a pretty basic one. You're coming of age, getting more exposed to things in the world, and you pick up slews of aesthetics and styles from all over trying to find yourself. It's not unreasonable to imagine that the dark and mysterious or all-around hardcore finds its way in there somehow. The unorthodox and offbeat can be appealing, especially to those who, for the correct reasons or not, feel they don't really have a place in the living and material world. It's cathartic. It's freedom to rationalize and express whatever's got you down, or whatever burrows its way into your head as a nasty, intrusive thought. Plus, as we mentioned prior, the macabre is everywhere, and it can be hard to escape its influence anyways. Beyond the minds of fever-pitched 14-year-olds, my main interest, and the reason I wanted to start researching this topic to begin with, is speculating on how the macabre has evolved from an art trend to a wide-reaching media and social phenomenon to a now ubiquitous component of a generational and cultural lifestyle, and how that reflects on how our world as a whole has evolved. Millennials. Yep, now is the part where we gotta talk about millennials. Oh my god, does anyone else hate adulting? Like, I just need a heckin' pupper right now. Yeah, I listen to Neutral Milk Hotel. How can you tell? Millennial culture, and I do hate to call it that, is perhaps the first place, at least among modern generations, spanning boomers to the hilariously named Gen Alpha, to embrace the macabre as a lifestyle in the face of an increasingly grim world. Instead of gauche murals of skeletons dancing on top of graves, they have suicide memes about exploding housing costs and college tuition. Instead of String Quartet No. 14 or Camille Saint-Saëns's Danse Macabre, they have Midwest Emo and Ballad of Costa Concordia by Car Seat Headrest. The outlets may have changed with time, but the themes are still there, and have only become more integrated with the day-to-day of millennial Americana as opposed to French peasantry. There's some level of camaraderie that plays a part here, I think. Looking at this through a lens of charitability and empathy, these expressions of suicide and hopelessness are a way to share experiences and know that you aren't entirely alone with these uncomfortable and existential thoughts. For every "me too, thanks" you get on your meme that you posted on Me IRL, there's another person somewhere in the world saying, "I understand how you feel." There's real meaning there, I think, to someone on the other side of the screen. A simple gesture of validation can go a long way in soothing the weight that somebody might be carrying all on their own. This integration of the macabre into the daily lifestyle of millennials paints an interesting picture, one that isn't all too different from the 15th century picture we talked about earlier. The popularization of early macabre was due to famine, wars, plagues, a lack of modern medical care. It speaks to a rising social consciousness and understanding of one's own mortality in an era where such causes just seemed to be the norm, and that the death they bring was inevitable no matter what. That the world is grim, and the only thing one can do to maintain agency in the wake of these catastrophes was to dance and embrace joy. Or post memes about how you want to die on the internet. It does seem a little nihilistic when you put it like that. But contrast this with millennials. Millennials came of age in an era of endless Middle Eastern wars, back-to-back financial collapses, a literal plague, exploding costs of living accommodations including food, housing, healthcare, education, increasingly blatant corruption by the ruling class, visible more and more every day, rampant exposure to the problems not only in their own lives, but in the lives of people all around the globe thanks to the internet. Did I mention the climate crisis yet? I mean, just to name a few. Millennials were forced into a world that reminds them every day of the inevitability of danse macabre. No matter who they are or what they did, death would come to unify them all and reset everything. From dearth or from abundance, they will return to the dust from which they came. The ways in which the macabre has been embraced by millennials isn't all that different from the French peasants of ye old days. The proletariat finding solace in the fact that we will all die, no matter you an oligarch or a peasant, a Jeff Bezos or a broke-ass college student. The human connection of understanding and making a mockery of one's own futility in the face of, is a way to maintain agency and power over the chilling grips of an ever-grim world. Millennials and their succeeding generations see this daily. They feel powerless, and death is the ultimate catharsis that will reset everything. Politicians, the ones meant to represent them, seemingly don't mind, so long as the money keeps rolling in, lining their pockets and keeping the machine running. Multinational corpo CEOs obviously don't. They stay abusing child labor, destroying the planet, and co-opting some of the only means to which current generations can express their feelings about such a damned world, just bastardizing their struggles as another way to reach a new market. Their boomer parents often just don't get it, or don't believe in therapy to help them rationalize these struggles, thinking instead it's just a teenaged obsession with hardcore edgy shit, which has somehow persisted to God fuck, how old are millennials now? They're 40. Oh my god, that means I'm getting old. Millennials came of age seeing a world getting worse, being neglected more and more, with more and more of their own power being stomped out or invalidated. It can be hard to find hope and optimism in such a world. What are you supposed to do if you're trapped in the graveyard like everybody else, being reminded endlessly of your own demise? Millennials, much like the French peasants, sought not to resist the clutches of their death. Instead, in the imminence of such, they danced.